Well, the whole idea of going into a recession is not new to many nations, not even Nigeria. Well, yes, we are having a second one within the past 4 or 5 years. But then some have also alluded to the fact that way back in 1987, when Nigeria had a recession, we had to take some very drastic economic decisions as well, just as we are now. But this one is occasioned by a global health emergency, a pandemic. That is what we have now. And is Nigeria so badly hit? And what are the figures saying? What are the realities saying? Sometimes there's a challenge with that one. But we have two gentlemen discussing this issue with us this morning. Marcelo Keke is an economic consultant and CEO of Mascot Consult Limited. He is also a board member of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, NESG. He joins us virtually this morning. Thank you, Mr. Okeke, for joining us for this conversation. We also have Mr. Tunde Thomas, who is an economist and associate director at GDL Asset Management Limited. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
Let me begin with you. Yes, let me begin with you, Mr. Okeke. Clearly, we are not hearing of this for the first time. So many people have already alluded to it. You also heard the Minister of Finance saying there that this is likely to happen. And a number of people in the real sector, in the organized private sector, have been alluding to the fact that there is a possibility that we would go into a recession. Could it have been avoided?
Thank you for this question. There's no way we could have avoided it because the factors responsible for going into recession this time are beyond our control. You have external and internal factors. So the external factors we couldn't control, like the COVID-19 pandemic that led to the shutting down of the Nigerian economy for several months. And then the supply chain disruption, globally. So there's no way, we would have handled it locally, including the crash in the price of oil, which is the mainstay of our economy. And we are trading. Who do we trade with? When, flights were shut, plane flights, economies were shut down. Nobody is allowed to come in. People are not allowed to go out, and so on and so forth. So what could we have done? At that point in time, the factories that utilize our oil abroad, they were not functioning. And so we even had nothing to export. So all that, are now showing in this level of, decline in GDP that we are seeing. And locally, you have this issue of insecurity that appears to be going out of hand. Whether you're talking about kidnapping, whether you're talking about armed robbery, whether you're talking about banditry, whether you're talking about, cultism, all kinds of things. You have social unrest all over the place. So when you aggregate all this, that is what we are seeing now as this level of drop in GDP. I must even say that I am pleasantly surprised that it didn't go below the second quarter 2020 level, and that it came up to negative 3.23. I was thinking it would go much lower than the second quarter. So, but in any case, those are the issues. So many things went out of hand. External reserve dropped significantly because you were not exporting oil, and if you exported, the price of oil crashed to almost near zero. And so what do you realize? And our country continues to depend so much on oil, even as we speak. The so-called diversification, I think to me, largely remains a mere symptom. Sorry, government may have been doing or might be doing so many things, to diversify the economy. But in reality, the impact has not started showing, so that...
Well, we'll come to some of those issues, Mr. Okeke. Some of those issues about the oil and the non-oil sector, we'll come to that one. But let me begin. Let's have your opening comments here, Mr. Thomas. Is it possible for us to have avoided, this recession because we knew it was coming?
It's impossible to have avoided it because the main causative factors of the recession are actually not within the control of the Nigerian economy. They are extraneous in nature. The impact of COVID-19 is, as a global pandemic, is far-reaching. Currently, today in the world, we have more than 18 countries in recession as we speak. And the likelihood that some others are still going to go into recession is very high. The situation whereby, economies were on lockdown, production of goods and services were disrupted, supply chain all over the world was disrupted, has a great impact on, the impact of recession in Nigeria. And avoiding it, maybe we could have reduced it in a way if we had come out of the lockdown slightly earlier than we did. But essentially too, because of the challenges of the risk of infection and the effects it will have on the economy, I don't think there was a way we could have done that much earlier than we did.
But then perhaps that also, beg your pardon, perhaps that's also raised the issue, a challenge that a number of people have also alluded to, the trade-off between protecting people's health and protecting the economy. Every country had a challenge making that trade-off. Okay. Was this something that could have been done anyway?
Well, I think our own timing, to an extent, the gradual reopening of the economy started when we saw that the cases were on a decline to an extent. If we had done it much earlier, perhaps the level of infection could have escalated. So we needed to strike a balance between keeping the economy in expansion of growth phase and challenging the impacts of COVID-19 infection generally. I think if I were to score our response so far, I think by and large, the government has tried in that regard. The critical thing we need to look at is, the figures show that in quarter 2 of the year, the GDP declined by 6.1%. The last quarter, quarter 3, it declined by about 3.64%. It shows a reduction in the decline. So in the quest for recovery, I can see, after having gone to the abyss of 6.10, we are on a steady climb back. But the challenges, from what I can see, is the recovery from this recession might take the shape of a W curve. Essentially, what I mean by that is we dropped to 6.1. We are back to 3.64. There is a likelihood that after the boost in the economy occasioned by the Yuletide season and all that, with the second wave of infections gradually, spreading all over the world, there is a likelihood for another minor decline towards the first 2 months of next year, before we now start seeing the effects of the various vaccines that have been discovered take shape and generally loosen up and open up the economy so that activities can now start going, as normal.
So for you, it's a W?
It's a W, yeah.
Okay, let's find out from Mr. Okeke. Before I ask you what shape you see, whether U, V, W, whichever it is you see, I'd like to take you up on this because, you can't take this away. In 2016, Nigeria entered a recession. We exited a year after. In 2020, 4 years later, we're also in another recession. And 2 issues here. Is this just a case of circumstances, or there's something really with this administration when it comes to the economy, managing things that might happen and how we prepare ourselves? What do you see?
Is that for me? Is that for me?
Yes, that question is for you. Go ahead, please.
Okay. If like I did mention the factors that are responsible for the current one, many factors, external factors, if you like, exogenous, that were not within the control of this government and this economy. But in 2016, I can say that recession could have been avoided or could have been minimized. Yes, so many factors lead to this recession, including the weak management or improper management of the economy. Like my colleague there mentioned. For instance, we are now seeing that the decline of the economy in the second quarter, was much more than the decline in this second quarter. So it does follow, all things being equal, that with better management of the economy, we are likely to even do better in the last quarter. The management of the economy, now that we already know, what are our challenges, But the more we try to do that, the more challenges we're likely to have. The route to the route to achieving what I'm now saying is, for instance, the issue of diversification of the economy. Why will government not effectively diversify the economy? By massively, supporting other sectors of the economy rather than oil alone. I mean, that takes what is called focus and strategy. Now we're also talking about digital economy. Why will that not be fast-tracked and the necessary infrastructure put in place? Now that we know the coronavirus pandemic is still with us, but I think we are now knowing better how to manage it. That is why the number of casualties, in the past couple of days or weeks has gone down reasonably. So now that we are knowing how to handle coronavirus pandemic and observing all the safety nets, so I believe that things will get better. It's a question of taking the decision and putting in place the appropriate policies, so that this economy. It's not a rocket science. I mean, we don't exist in isolation. The other economies of the world. Let me also say, so our challenge is also largely a human factor. Because when we mention that other countries are going into recession and all that, is Nigeria economy like any other economy? What are we producing? What are we exporting? What do we have? And so on and so forth. So it's one thing to say other economies are also going into recession, to assuage our worry and all that. But it's another thing to know that we have a peculiar situation. What of the level of corruption that our president has, we are told, has also accepted as corruption, everywhere. Is it like that in other climes? So if these things are properly tackled head on, like corruption, mismanagement, leakages in the system, leakages, and let me tell you this one, for example, look at 2021 budget. Because of this recession we are in now, it needs to be rejigged. The assumptions, the basis for arrival at those figures that you have in the 2021 budget, no longer, much of them no longer exist. If you talk about the exchange rate, for example, was it not based, or is it not based on $360 per barrel? And where we are now, where are we now? Are we not pushing towards 500 naira per dollar? Or the level of oil production that was assumed, where are we today? We are at 1.67. When we put in the budget something close to $2.0 million per barrel. So if certain things are handled well, economy management, certainly we will minimize the level of recession or even quickly come out of it. It's not a rocket science.
What shape do you see before we come back to Lagos? Is it a V, a W, a U for you, or maybe a shape we don't even know about?
Given what I know about us in this economy, it's going to be a U-shape, curve, meaning that we will not come out immediately. It's not going to be a V, because it's the same people, it's the same style, it's the same pattern. If you keep doing one thing and think you will get a different result, it's very unlikely, because the consumer purchasing power is badly hit, it's badly hit. Where is the consumption level that will pull up certain things? That is why the level of inflation will continue to get worse. And whatever you do to tame inflation, you pay for it, somehow. So it's going to be U-shaped.
Okay. Well, interesting. We're talking about, now that we're talking about shapes, there are a number of shapes that are included in that report by this one, for instance, is that the red one points to you what's happening in the real oil sector, and the blue one, almost a straight line, talks about what we have in the non-oil sector. Mr. Thomas, it would seem from this graph and the one to come that we seem to have fared so much better over the years, consistently on a regular basis in the non-oil sector than we have in the oil sector. Is that saying anything to us?
The oil sector essentially was subject to the whims and caprices of the international oil markets. And in this particular year, whereby demand for, energy was reduced because, people were locked down worldwide, production levels reduced in factories and all that. Demand for our main output,
Revenue
which is
earner.
oil, is, reduced. So currently, oil accounts for about 90% of Nigeria's foreign exchange and foreign exchange earnings, and about 60% of government revenues. So we are largely an oil-dependent economy. Until we start to shift focus from oil to the non-oil sector, boost agriculture, exports, and manufacturing and all that, increase value chain and all. And in doing so, we engage a lot of the people in the rural areas, the youths are agitating. We need to get them, into the productive sector.
One minute, Mr. Thomas.
Okay.
Clearly, from the NBS figures,
Yes.
we have contributed more than 90, about 96, 97% more of that into the GDP from the non-oil sector. 97% of contribution into the non-oil sector, into the economy, came from the non-oil sector.
Yes.
The rest of it came from the oil sector.
From the oil sector, yeah.
What else do we need to tell us where we should make our mainstay? Or is it that the non-oil sector that is contributing so much from the figures of the NBS is not as strong, is not as standard, is not as contributory, or what?
In terms of foreign exchange earnings, it's not as much as what we realize from the oil sector.
Okay.
Largely, like I said earlier, about 90% of our foreign exchange earning is dependent on the oil sector. Yeah, despite the fact that the non-oil sector has, attributed to the growth of GDP, we need to still look at how to develop that sector. For instance, we are boosting agriculture, but there are still issues with value chain. The level of production has increased. Crops are being churned out of the farms in large quantities, but then we don't have the right equipment, storage, processing, and all that to keep those goods or to even add value to those inputs that are coming from the farm. These, are the sectors that we need to look at to boost economic activity in the economy in order to, have a better balance of payment terms with our foreign partners and to increase our non-oil revenues.
Just before we take on Mr. Okeke, for a lot of Nigerians, the question is usually, how does this affect me? Clearly, we've been in recession before the NBS put it out because this is for the quarter we just ended. So clearly, Nigerians have been in recession now, in some sense, before the figures came out.
Yes.
So for people now, in terms of businesses, those who are employed, that don't own their businesses, those who are unemployed, those who live from hand to mouth, as they say, how is this recession going to affect them essentially?
Okay. Now that we're in a recession, government's ability to spend has been hampered. It trickles down to the individuals on the streets. Companies are not able to produce as much because aggregate demand has reduced. This will lead to a lot of companies, SMEs and the others, cutting costs by downsizing. There will likely be an increase in unemployment. There will be a decline in purchasing power. Generally, the layman on the streets will feel the effects of the recession by way of not having the liquidity of resources to spend on his everyday consumables. So that's the immediate effect it's going to have. Beyond that, the important thing is not to dwell on the current recession, is to look at the way out.
Okay.
Because I can see, from the data available, that if we continue this trend, the major cause, like I said earlier, is the global pandemic. And with the opening up of the economy, now people are beginning to move around freely. The transportation sector, aviation sector are beginning to see a bit of activity. With a bit of stimulus from the government by way of palliatives and incentives to critical sectors in the economy, I'm sure within the next 2-3 months, we'll be on the way out of this current recession.
Well, Mr. Okeke, you've seen the figures, you've seen the graph as well, and the shapes from the figures of the NBS. Is it any comfort that we seem to have done better in the non-oil sector in the quarter under review than in the oil sector. 91.3% from the non-oil sector was contributed to the GDP as opposed to 8.73% in the oil sector.
Yes, on one hand, we'll be happy that the non-oil sector is accounting for that, measure, that part of GDP. But on the other hand, you know that there's no magic about it. We are still substantially an oil-dependent economy. So while the non-oil sector is engaging so many people, providing jobs and livelihood here and there, but when it comes to the issue of money, hard currency, which rules the world, we're in trouble because we depend on oil and we don't control the price of the oil. Now that we control the quantity we export and even the quantity we produce locally because of some social challenges, we are not in control. So when you juxtapose, these two sides, you find out that yes, we'll be celebrating the performance of the non-oil sector. But it's also important, that the non-oil sectors, whatever activities are going on there, are, prioritized by the government and more focus put on them, so that some of them will begin to assist, and put it in quote, assist oil in running this economy, assist oil. My colleague has quoted, yes, when it comes to foreign exchange inflow to this economy, we depend on oil for over 90%, And so which other product do we export to get hard currency? Until we arrive at that point, there's no effective diversification of the economy. Some people are in agriculture, but that is a largely subsistence farming they are doing, And so we need mechanized farming. We need large-scale farming. We need to do other value-added things so that effectively we now start exporting those things to support oil, so that the shock in oil does not always shock this economy to its, grade.
Diversifying the economy from the oil to the non-oil sector is something that we've been talking about for so many years. But you also, Mr. Okeke, you raised some issues earlier of things that could have also contributed to this pandemic. So let me ask you, Mr. Thomas, beyond the pandemic, how much did the issues of insecurity, rate of poverty, and the level of unemployment, how much did it, help to slide us into this recession?
Okay, largely a whole lot.
So with or without the pandemic, we probably would have.
It's very convenient to say, the pandemic here because of the global effects it has. But when we look around my environments, movements, commuting, little things like going from Lagos to Ibadan, you'll probably spend about 7 hours on the road. That's critical production or productive time that is being wasted just to commute from one end to the other. Some of the things or figures that go into GDP computation, beyond just the outputs, value-adding things like moving raw materials from the ports to the destination of the manufacturing companies, all those have been constrained. And with all these bottlenecks, production is not as efficient as it's supposed to be. So there is need to, tackle insecurity. People can move around and feel secure because, you are either scared of headsmen or militants or whatever, robbers and all the rest attacking you.
If you don't mind holding that thought for a while, just for a little bit, to take a number of messages, so we'll be right back with you to conclude your thoughts. Please stay with us. Thanks for staying with us. Mr. Thomas, you began by proffering a solution to security or insecurity. With all these that Mr. Laolu Akonde has just talked about, seems to be an attempt to address the questions of poverty and unemployment?
Yes.
And what do you think? How productive?
Well, I think to a large extent, the effects will be far-reaching in due course and over time. But essentially, as a country, for us to be able to, withstand the shock of recession and avoid it in the near future, we need to look at ways to diversify the foreign exchange source of the economy. from oil to other, real sectors. Because globally now, the world is gradually looking at phasing out the use of fossil fuels. And that constitutes about 90% of our foreign exchange earnings. By the time, this current lull in demand and fall in price, due to COVID, but beyond that, by the time Western economies start looking at green energy alternatives and reduce the amount of fossil fuels they are buying from us and other countries that export petroleum products or crude, then the price will definitely, be at the bottom end. And given the fact that the cost of production of oil is about $20, if we are, selling at anything below 40, then we are even earning less than, the margin is less than the cost of producing it. So in the very near future, it is very critical that we look at, and we need to be very quick and particular about it, as ways of diversifying the economy so that our overdependence on oil gives way to other. Before the advent of oil, we were doing a lot in agri sector, cocoa, cash crops, and all the rest. And even now, we can still continue to do that and look at how to even improve the value of that.
Okay.
For instance, last year, 2019, in Indonesia, Nigeria's oil export revenues were about $12 billion US, while Indonesia, from oil palm alone, they got about 10 billion. The 12 billion US dollars we got accounted for about 50% of our revenues last year, while the $10 billion Indonesia got from oil palm accounted for less than 10% of their total revenue as a country. So we need to focus on other critical sectors that can.
But there's something that you mentioned the other time, which is that of getting back into production. And I think that's also something that a number of people are thinking about. Mr. Okeke, you also mentioned the need for us to get back into production. Now, the challenge is right there for government, clearly. On the one hand is the economic sustainability plan that government has talked about and is talking about. You heard the vice president's aide speaking there. On the other hand, are the tariff increases that seem to eat a little more into the revenues of the micro, small, and medium enterprises. Fuel price increase because the SMEs, largely the micro and small businesses, use petrol generators more because we do not have electricity, at least not significantly enough for now. And there is also that electricity tariff increase for, that cuts across, a number of categories in the consumer bank. How do we address these? How do we balance these challenges out?
Well, it has never been easy, in this economy when somebody goes into production or manufacturing. So what is needed now, like I said earlier on, is the staying power, to see positive changes within the economy. Because you have these policy somersaults, that have been working against many economic agents. A policy is in place. By the time you want to utilize it and you go into a certain field or certain area, the policy is changed. For instance, since this pandemic, coronavirus, started early this year, the government has been coming up with so many policies. No, certainly I must tell you, some of them are ill-digested. In fact, some are counterproductive, and some could work, in fact, do work against some others that are in place. You understand? So with this one now, when you move forward as an SME or as an established organization, and government comes up with a certain policy, certainly that will be counterproductive. Let me mention this one, for example. When a manufacturer, a producer in Nigeria here wants to import, maybe equipment or whatever from abroad, and he is told that he cannot import anything unless directly from the manufacturer abroad. And if you go through a third party, and third party will mean somebody that is the agent of the manufacturer, and the government will not make forex available to such person. It doesn't work like that. Because many organizations manufacture, produce, and they don't get involved in the distribution and all that. So if you from here connect their distributor abroad, the government will deny you for it. What that does is that frustrated importer here now move to the black market. And that black market, the impact in the black market is what we are seeing. And that is why part of why Naira is crashing. So certain policies are counterproductive. And so when you have mentioned the plan, sustainability plan by the government, is it a long-term plan? How long is it supposed to last? That's a short-term plan. There's need for us to have a long-term plan and begin to have the short ones, built into them, so that you know where you are going. And when you talk about sustainability, we are looking at the long haul. We're looking at the long haul. We are not looking at policies you make now and it becomes a kind of magic wand and something begins to work. No, it is slow and steady, and that is how the economy works. If you just inject something to the economy and it suddenly gets kick-started or jump-started, certainly you may not see it last. So what I'm saying is that the government has to determine, to do something for the other sector that we supported agriculture and consistently show the will to do that. Let certain political decisions or indecisions not work against those sectors. And let it not be that somebody comes upon tomorrow to be in charge and goes on to cancel certain existing policies, that are working. You understand? So that puts policy making in this economy in a kind of crisis.
Policies.
In a movement, this one comes up, this one removes it, this one comes up, this one removes it. Like I'm now hearing that every year there's going to be a new finance act. I don't know how that's going to be working. Because even the budget itself, because it's just 1 year plan, you see how we'll be grappling with it. Unfortunately, we don't bother to look at how far and how well we have done with each budget each year. If we do that, we will now see that the budgeting process or the budgeting practice in this economy has just become a mere formality.
Okay,
so
Mr.
whether we are doing well or not doing well,
let me see if I can take you up.
Sectors are getting or making it the way they are expected or not making, nobody bothers, and we just move into a new one.
Pardon me, let me see if I can take you up on this issue before we begin to wind down on this conversation. Now, for some people, they think we never even came out of that recession in 2016. And if you look at the figures, really, you see that we've never come back to that 4.0 growth that we had before the recession in 2016. We're still, averaging 3.2 over the years. So regarding policies, these policies don't just come up. They come up from a team. And most times the government says, well, this has been well thought of. Now, we still have that same team largely responsible for getting Nigeria out of this recession. So I'd like to ask, how much confidence do you have in the team, the economic handlers which we have in the country right now, from the Ministry of Finance to the Economic Advisory Council and other different teams that we have advising the government? From what you have seen, how much confidence, how much trust do you have in them to get us out of this recession?
If we are talking about the economic team per se, you should know that the committee set up by the president last year is an advisory body. It's an advisory body. If they were to be internal people, if they were, in fact, they are even external, if they were to be inside, who not only take part in putting together the policy, but also drive the implementation, you are likely to achieve better results. But the way it is now, that economic team, the commission, or whatever, they are all outsiders. And so when you are making policy or trying to drive policy making from outside, you have problem, because those on ground who are going to be the implementers, maybe they are not part and parcel of that policy making process. By the time it gets to them, it becomes a given. That's something they must implement. And perhaps there could be a disparity between what they can do, to realize those policies and what the people outside are seeing in making the policy they come up with. And that's the character of the current setup we have in government. And then you come to the issue of the will of the government. Does he have the will to take certain decisions and see them through? Like this policy now of liberalizing the issue of fuel importation and so on and so forth. Where does that leave us with the building of refineries here in Nigeria? Where does that leave us with even running the existing refineries? Where does that leave us with encouraging some investors to even build refineries here, and so on and so on and so forth. So you have this kind of confusion. And we are talking about, selling some of our assets. And we have been talking that for
All
so
right,
long. And which
Mr.
assets
Okeke,
have been
just one
disposed of.
moment now. Talking solutions now. I'd like you to take you up on this very, very quickly as we wind down, and then we'll come to Mr. Thomas to conclude. Well, there are those who also feel that if, for instance, in a family, finances are down, the parents will make some adjustments, cut some costs, and then just to help the the family to stay afloat. Will it be too simplistic to assume that, a country like Nigeria would also say, you know what, why doesn't government start from cutting the cost of governance in the in the struggle to solve this economic recession problem? Do you see that
My
as the
brother,
way to
you have
go?
said it. That should be an integral part of the policy, because there's a lot of wastages, there are a lot of leakages, in the economy from the government side. We have been talking about cost of governance, cost of government in this country. So if what is going on now will
All
make
right.
them, to adjust a cost, even if it's only on experimental basis for this year and next year. You talk
Okay.
about traveling abroad. You
All right,
talk
all right,
about
Mr. Okeke. We're running out of time, so let me just quickly take Mr. Tunde Thomas on that as well as we wind down. Cutting cost of governance, is it a way to go? Is this something that can be done?
I totally agree that it's something we need to look at, because clearly, I mean, we have so many leakages in the government.
What are these leakages?
Democracy is a bit bloated.
What are these leakages?
I mean, the bicameral legislator we have and the mirror. I mean, largely we have a bloated.
But that's not something
governance structure.
that's not an economic policy. That's more like constitutional adjustments.
Well, I think we need to look at that to see how we can reduce the cost of governance. Even though the impact might not be so much, but I mean, this will be far-reaching in the economy as a whole, and it will set the right example for others to follow.
Okay.
As we try to come out of this pandemic-induced recession.
Okay. We have to thank you very much, Mr. Tunde Thomas. He
Thanks
is
for
an
having me.
economist and associate director at GDL Asset Management Limited, as well as Mr. Marcel Okeke, who is a board member at Nigeria Economic Summit Group, NESG. He's also an economist and CEO of Mascot Consult Limited. Gentlemen, thank you so much for your time and thoughts.